Hello, BookTube. I've got a tag here for you today. This is the Spring Has Sprung tag. I was tagged by Dane Cobain over at Dane Reads. I'll link to his original video in the description down below. Apologies for the awkwardness of this setup. I'm going to be reading the prompts off of my computer screen here, so if you see me looking down at the computer, just ignore me. The tag is Spring Has Sprung, which is presumably a tag that gets done in the spring. Here it is early August, but I think Dane has gotten behind on some of his tags, is the rationale for just doing this now. But the questions are such, well, I mean, they're all questions about books. So, if it's a few months late, who cares? Um, so, number one is flowers. All the flowers are blooming again. Pick a book that's a fresh take on a retelling. So Dane, in his book, did the Dark Materials trilogy by Philip Pullman, and then apologized for saying it's probably not so fresh anymore. Which, if that's the criteria, makes me a little bit worried about my own pick here, because this book is even older. But it is, well, relatively. It's a relatively fresh take. It's The Once and Future King by T.H. White, which is a retelling of The Death of Arthur, or La Mort d'Arthur story by Thomas Malory. As somebody who's interested in Greek myths and old legends and stuff like that, on this channel, I've reviewed a lot of books which are retellings of older myths or legends. But this, I think, was one of the best ones, in that it was very faithful to Thomas Malory's original story and rewrote it in a way that made it completely accessible to a modern audience. Number two is Cadbury Mini Eggs. Obviously, the superior springtime candy of choice. Yeah, fair enough. Pick a book that you consider to be a sweet treat. So I'm going to go with The Three Musketeers by Alexander Dumas, which I've read twice now in my life. Once when I was in 5th or 6th grade as an adolescent, and once as an adult. And both times I was completely surprised by how fun the book was. Because, you think, well, it's an old classic. It's from the 19th century. It'll be okay, but it'll have, the pacing and everything will be off by modern standards. And it's not at all. It's a book that could easily, be sold in an airport lobby, just in terms of how fast paced the plot is and how fun it is. I think when it comes to classic books, this is easily the most fun classic book. The sequels was not so impressed by. Sorry. The sequels were good, impressive in their way, not quite as fun. Not quite as fun, but that first book in the series is really a lot of fun. Number three, Allergies. Seasonal allergies often make your eyes water. Pick a book that made you cry. So I think this is fairly common for a lot of us. When I was a child, there were a lot of books that made me cry. I cried a lot easier when I was a child. Now that I'm an adult, even though some books make me feel sad, I don't really get so worked up emotionally about it the way I did when I was younger. But of course, there are exceptions, and the last book that got me teary-eyed in a public place, I was reading this in a coffee shop, and it was The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. And this was about 4 years ago I read it now, so the details are a little bit hazy, but there's one poor family that the youngest Karamazov brother befriends and tries to help. And there's the sick child in that family who dies just because he got sick and it was a poor family. And it's just such a sad scene when that child dies, and it talks about the father and the family, and I really hated the book for making me get so emotional, because I don't really like to get emotional, especially when I'm reading, especially when I'm in a public place. But you've got to have a heart of stone to read through that passage. It was just really going for the emotions, and I think it got there. All right, number 4, spring cleaning. Out with the old and in with the new. Pick a book to unhaul. Sorry, I'm gonna reach for it. Reach. Okay. Sorry, I forgot to get this ready. But yeah, Heart of Dread, Frozen. Frozen, which is book 1 in the Heart of Dread series by Melissa De La Cruz and Michael Johnston, which is just awful. Well, actually, it's readable if you let yourself go with some of the awfulness of it. If you just kind of roll with some of the really bad cliches and stuff like that. But yeah, certainly no reason to keep that book around. Number 5, Spring Break. It's the perfect time for an adventure. Pick a book involving a road trip. Dane on his channel did On the Road by Jack Kerouac. And before I even got to the part of the video where he was giving his answer for that, I was also thinking On the Road by Jack Kerouac, because of course you would think On the Road by Jack Kerouac. In fact, it's such an obvious answer that I feel a little bit guilty doing it, because what fun is it to go with the obvious answers? And yet I'm going to go with it. And I actually did read that book. It was ages ago. I read it when I was 19. So I remember it only in snippets at this point. But I did read it. 19 is the age when you're reading Jack Kerouac, right? When you desperately want to be cool, and you hear that all the cool people are reading Jack Kerouac. So I did read it. I'm definitely due for a reread one of these days. All right. Anyways, number 6, mating season. It's that time of year in the animal kingdom to make some babies. Pick a book with smutty delights. Okay. Again, I'm gonna go with a cliche here, but I did actually read this book, so I figure if you actually read it, it's fair game. Which is Lady Chatterley's Lover by D.H. Lawrence. This being booktube, I suspect most people are familiar with this book. This was the infamous book that got banned for obscenity all over the world. And for like 40 years, it was first published in 1920, but it wasn't legally published in most of the world until 1960, and even later in some countries. It's interesting how times have changed, because if you read that book now, you're like, well, this is nothing compared to what you can find in 100 other books on the bookshelves nowadays. If you walk into any bookstore, there are, I don't know, 100 other books in that bookstore which are at least as sexually explicit as the Lady Chatterley, if not more. And yet, it does have the love scenes. Like I'm sure that was quite shocking stuff by 1920 standards. So it deserves its reputation, especially when you consider it in its time. It won't be shocking for you now, but anyways, number 7, rainbows. I just feel like spring is made of freaking rainbows. Pick a book featuring an LGBTQ plus character or characters. So I'm going to go for The Persian Boy by Mary Renault. I hope I'm not... I hope I'm remembering the author correctly, but it's definitely The Persian Boy. So this is part of the trilogy about Alexander the Great, which is historical fiction. And this is the second book in the trilogy. The first book in the trilogy hinted about homosexual love between Alexander and his friends, but this book, there's no hinting. It's quite explicit, and it's about it's about a Persian eunuch whose name I can't remember at the moment. It was about 5 years ago or 6 years ago that I read the book, um, and it's a real historical character. Bagoas or something was his name. It was a real historical character. This eunuch who was previously part of the Persian king's court, who became part of Alexander the Great's entourage once Alexander the Great came in and conquered it. And he was supposed to be a really beautiful eunuch, and there were rumors at the time that he and Alexander the Great had a relationship. And it's one of those things that I think has become controversial over the years, because people who some people have an interest in saying that Alexander the Great was definitely not a homosexual, and some people have an interest maybe in saying that Alexander the Great was a homosexual, and it gets political and stuff like that. But this book definitely takes it's historical fiction, so it's everything's a reimagining. But in the book, it's definitely a homosexual romance between Alexander the Great and the Persian boy. The book was published in the early 1970s, and as you can imagine, banned in a number of libraries across America, and I believe is considered somewhat of a classic in the gay community. I haven't reviewed it on this channel yet. I've given it a written review on my blog. I didn't love the book. I didn't care for the prose, which I found a little bit too poetic or too descriptive for my taste. But I don't know. It's worth reading, just for its kind of cultural status, if nothing else. Okay, moving on. Number 9. Number 8. Number 8. Spring Awakening. This is one of my all-time favorite musicals, even though it's filled with completely dysfunctional characters. But by the way, in case it's not obvious, this is me reading off the prompts. I actually have not seen Spring Awakening myself. Pick a book that's also filled with completely dysfunctional characters. So, I'm not sure what the rules are on double dipping, but the Brothers Karamazov, again, strikes me as a book with really dysfunctional characters. I mean, that is one dysfunctional family. So, is it allowed to use a book twice? Because if it is, then this would fit perfectly. Okay, number 9. In Like a Lion, Out Like a Lamb. Pick a book series that didn't get better as it progressed. So I was looking through the book series I've been reviewing lately. The Chronicles of Amber, which I've read the first 5 books in the series, collected in this volume here, and am given to understand that as the series progresses, it's not as good. Steve Donahue on BookTube is of that opinion. I think he said that on his Q&A a few times. But I've actually not progressed all the way with the Chronicles of Amber. So, can I count that just because I've heard people say it? The other thing which sticks to mind is Anno Dracula, which the first book was amazing. The second book was pretty good. And then I've heard a number of people say that the subsequent books are not as good. I took their word for it and just did not continue with the series after that. So, can I count that just because I've heard it's not as good? Probably not. So the one series that I have read all the way through that definitely had a dip in quality is the Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn series. Sorry, Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. So the first two books, of course, are classics: The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. According to the critics, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is the superior book of the two. But then there are two other sequels that nobody likes to talk about: Tom Sawyer Abroad and Tom Sawyer Detective, which Mark Twain wrote just because he needed the money, and which are they're definitely readable. Like if it comes to readable prose, you have no trouble getting through them. But boy, what a tremendous drop in quality they are. And then there are a number of other Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn stories which did not get published, at least not in Mark Twain's lifetime. Some unfinished stories and stuff like that, which I've not read, but I'm given to understand are also a tremendous drop in quality. But I've read through all four of the published books in that series, and yeah, there's definitely a drop in quality with the last two. Okay, number 10, Fun in the Sun, Tag Some Friends. So I'm going to tag Books of Blood, Elizabeth Tyree over at Soul Stained Ink. Or was it Ink Stained Soul? Sorry, Elizabeth. You're getting tagged regardless. Mindy's Book Journey, Jay Shea, Graham over at the Archive, and then a new YouTube acquaintance of mine, Kelsey Bain, who I'm not sure if he would consider himself a booktuber, but he talks about books on his YouTube channel. So, Kelsey, if you haven't already joined up with BookTube, consider this your invitation to join up with your first tag, and yeah, I'd be interested to see what your answers are for this. Okay, so yes, I'm gonna finish off here.